hopefully not too many late nights in the last couple of days, but you all look wide awake and eager to listen and learn. We've had a fantastic discussion already with Justice Michael Kirby, and really looking forward to the next 1.5 hours of interaction between you guys and him. Before I introduce Justice Michael Kirby, of course, I'd like to introduce the Vice Chancellor, the founding Vice Chancellor of this university, Professor C. Raj Kumar, to welcome you to campus and to say a few words as well. So I'll hand over to you, Professor Raj Kumar, first and foremost.
A very good morning. Proud privilege to welcome all of you to this, to the university and of course to India. Sean and I have been working on this program for a while, so I would really like to thank my colleague, Professor Sean Starr, the Director of the Center for India-Australia Studies, for really promoting the idea of developing a stronger partnership across different institutions, and I'm very delighted that we are able to host all of you. It's also a very special occasion for me personally today because we are hosting Honorable Mr. Justice Michael Kirby. Justice Kirby is Australia's gift to the humanity. In many ways, his extraordinary contributions to the development of jurisprudence globally is truly inspiring, and he has inspired generations of lawyers and judges and law students and law academics, not only in Australia and India, but also around the world. He has been a passionate friend of India and has had the opportunity to work very closely with many Indian jurists in the last several decades, at least two of whom are very closely connected, have been connected with our university and me personally, both of whom are unfortunately not alive. Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer, former judge of the Supreme Court of India, and Justice P.N. Bhagwati, former Chief Justice of India. I also want to mention that there is so much that one can talk about Justice Kirby, but then the most important part of his contribution is the fact that he was able to bring in a stronger and a deeper connectedness to comparative law and comparative jurisprudence in judicial decision making. As I know in the room there are students who belong to law, but also there are students who pursue international relations and other disciplines. Law is one of the more conservative disciplines and is much more deeply wedded to precedent and as well as geographical context, culture and all of that. I think Justice Kirby belongs to that generation of path-breaking and far-sighted individuals who was able to see the future long before it existed, and because of that he has been able to transform and even show a mirror to the future in relation to comparative constitutional law as well as many other areas of public law. So in a way we are very fortunate, although I have in fact, I have known of him for long, and as I said, many Indian judges passionately, remember his contributions and his frequent visits to India and support for India. But I met him for the first time when I was giving a talk at the UNSW Law School, and I didn't know how he looked like, so I finished my talk. The Human Rights Center was hosting the talk, and there was this really sort of completely self-effacing, humble individual sitting in the room, and at the end of the talk he approached me and congratulated and thanked and all of that, and then he introduced himself that I'm Michael Kirby, and boom, it just it made my day. But more importantly, I also felt how much such extraordinary individuals like him have lived a life of humility and grace and continue to make that contribution that he is making. In fact, his current visit to India is also reflective of his larger commitment to the cause of law and access to justice and rule of law, and he continues to be this moral and powerful and persuasive voice in the field of global jurisprudence. So I want to personally thank him. Before I say a few words about about the program, I am very delighted to make this big announcement today that we are appointing, and he has kindly agreed, Justice Michael Kirby has agreed to become an honorary adjunct professor of Jindal Global Law School and OP Jindal Global University by virtue of my powers as a Vice Chancellor of the University, I have great pleasure in presenting this appointment to you. So before I formally invite Justice Kirby to make his remarks, let me just share some of my own reflections about why we are doing this. I will also have an opportunity to talk to you a little bit about this university and its founding story on another occasion. But today what I want to do is that I want you to kind of think about your role here as, in many ways, the young people of Australia spending a few weeks in India. And I think it is fair to say that the moment, one of the things about India is its extraordinary complexity and its extraordinary diversity. Just to give you a little bit of perspective of what I mean by this is that I belong to a place called Kanyakumari, which is the southernmost tip of India. If you look at the India map, Kanyakumari is the southernmost tip of India. That's where India ends in the south. You can just jump into the Indian Ocean. In fact, it is located in the conglomeration of the Arabian Sea, Bay of Bengal, and the Indian Ocean. And you could jump and swim to Sri Lanka. It is the furthest point of India. Now, and of course, my wife is a Punjabi Jain from Delhi. And when I moved to Delhi, I just didn't know Hindi. That's the dominant language, and that's the language which is spoken in many parts of North India. She doesn't speak my language, and most of the time we speak in English, which is not one of the Indian languages, obviously. So, and layers of Indian diversity will be reflected as you discover this country where there is absolutely nothing at all that really defines and signifies that this is what India is about. In a way, that's actually the strength of India. You can't define Indianness through a particular set of characteristics that this is what unites this country. In fact, I used to, when I spoke about this in different parts of the world, the question always that comes up is there one thing that really unites India, that everybody from Nagaland and Sikkim and Manipur to Jammu and Kashmir to Kanyakumari to Gujarat, all of them relate to? Obviously, religion is not, caste is not, food habits are not, climatic conditions are not, culture is not, language definitely is not. The festivals that we celebrate, it's not. There are different ones. The gods that we pray, and we pray or don't pray, there's no similarity. If you really think very hard, if there's one thing that really unites India, I have to say it's cricket. I mean, cricket is the closest that actually unites India, where every part of India can relate to. As much as it sounds funny, that's the reality, in the sense that you cannot. And so people sometimes, even many of us in India, don't realize the diversity of India, that there is not a single aspect that is, because we might, even I would say, Hinduism is a very interesting way of looking at India too. So almost 80% of Indians are Hindus. But that doesn't explain anything at all, because the gods that some Hindus worship in different parts of India are completely different from the gods who, in the name of Hinduism, people worship in other parts of India. I have friends who are Hindus in this part of India who are absolutely clueless about the gods who I've been told that Hindu gods in, say, Tamil Nadu. And you travel a bit within the state of Tamil Nadu, in Kanyakumari to Tiruchi to Chennai and Madurai, there are different types of gods who people worship in the name of Hinduism. So the names, the practices, the day. And then, of course, it also gets even more complex. A lot of people think about India that there are lots of vegetarians, and most people in India are vegetarians, but Not really. Most people in India are actually not vegetarians. And so, again, but then India becomes even more complicated because they may be vegetarians on Fridays or Tuesdays or some festivals, or in a way, don't try to understand India with the objective of attempting to define India. And so, in a way, one of a very good friend of mine, and I don't know whether we are meeting him, which you should read his book if you have not already. His name is Shashi Tharoor. Shashi Tharoor has written a number of books, but one of his most outstanding book is called India, Midnight to the Millennium. And in that book, he talks about the complexity of India, but also he says about that an observation or a statement that you make about India, most likely that the opposite to that statement is also true. And that's the kind of complexity that we are dealing with. So I want to take this moment to congratulate all of you to take a decision to come to India. I have always maintained that India is not for the weak-hearted. And so the fact that you have chosen to come to India shows that you are prepared to engage with India. It also means that you will in a way have the opportunity to pursue a lifelong journey to understand a very old, complex civilization. Almost all aspects of human lives, including thinking and thought processes, have evolved in this part of the world. And this is a great opportunity as young people for you to understand and engage. Now, this program is very special for us because I have long maintained that the India-Australia engagement, relationship, and broader collaboration has always been very limited and mostly myopic in thinking. And people have talked mostly about the fact that both of us play cricket, and that gives us reasons to become sort of friends. Unfortunately, that has not happened in the sense that there is very little awareness about Australia and Australians in general, but Australia's larger understanding of its society within India. And I would say this is not very different even within Australia vis-a-vis India. I have had so I want to say this to you so that you all, since I think you come from what? Monash University, Murdoch University, UNSW, and which other university we have?
ANU.
ANU. So 4 leading Australian universities are present here. Let me say that my interaction with Australian universities is the following, and I'm going to be very candid in this, and then before I invite Justice Michael Kirby. Nearly 2 decades ago, this was early 90s, and I was a student in Loyola College, Madras, during the year 1991 to 94. And in early 90s, Australian universities were wanting to get, they continue to want to get Indian students, but at that time there was this urge and excitement to be able to get foreign students, obviously as a revenue earning mechanism for Australian universities. So Australian universities, including some of the names represented in this room, used to have these shops set up in Chennai and other cities in India, and they used to provide what was notoriously known as on-the-spot admissions. So imagine you go into one of these 5-star hotels where they have these shops, and then you just pick up a course and you get admitted into this leading Australian university. And this was my first introduction, by the way, to Australian University. And boy, I was thinking, you know what? This must be some sort of a Ponzi scheme. I mean, how could you it takes enormous effort in India to get into even a mediocre college, let alone a leading university. How could you just do this? And many Indians of my generation saw this evolution of Australian academic presence in India largely with a pejorative lens to see the relative mediocrity compared to the British higher education system and later the American higher education system. It took for me almost the next say 7 to 8 years when I went to Oxford later in 1998 and then to Harvard, and then of course the rest of my academic career, for me to experience the extraordinary and powerfully engaging intellectual presence of Australian academic institutions, truly transformative institutions that each one of you represent. I have been to each one of your universities and many more, and I can say that Australian higher education system is one of the most advanced, most developed and most sophisticated education systems in the entire world. Some of the Australian universities, including the ones which are represented here, are better than and more advanced in terms of their research capacities, their quality of faculty, their intellectually engaging environment than the British and the American and the Canadian and other universities. Unfortunately, that narrative doesn't exist in India. Even today, Australian universities are seen with a fairly pejorative sense because of the sort of wounds from the past of what I mentioned to you. So in a way, the objective when we envisage the Center for India-Australia Studies is to really develop a strong intellectual presence of India in Australia and Australia in India. This intellectual presence need to be based upon a broad-based engagement that looks at faculty, students, teaching, research, capacity building, training, programs that we can do together and we are doing together. And the India Immersion program is, and the new Colombo plans, funding of these programs is a stellar example of what we can do together. I also want to briefly mention about the fact that it is important. Why India is important is there should be a case made for it. It's natural for Australians and even other parts of the world to look at China seriously, and China's extraordinary economic growth and even social development and its contribution to human development, uplifting millions of people out of poverty, are truly remarkable achievements. And there's every reason why all of us need to be inspired with what China has done and what China is doing. At the same time, it's important for we in India and you in Australia to recognize the need for both our countries and societies to work closely due to certain important shared values that we both have, which includes but not limited to our commitment to democracy, our commitment to rule of law, our strong commitment to diversity and pluralism, our deeper commitment to values of inclusivity and engagement in all these matters. And that's something which, in a way, ought to provide the foundation for why India and Australia and Indians and Australians should be doing many things together. I will leave Justice Michael Kirby to talk about the judiciary and the role of law and justice in this matter, but to bring home the larger point that India today has approximately 1.35 billion people. And just to get that number and then to start thinking about the fact that 850 million people in India are less than 35 years of age. Just start thinking about it. 850 million people are less than 35 years of age. Indian life expectancy is approximately 72 years, which means that when the good part of the Western world, including United States, Europe, North America, Canada, and also many parts of the Asian world, including China and Japan, would have become older, India will be younger and will be younger for a longer time. This extraordinary demographic dividend that India is experiencing and will experience has very good reasons why countries such as Australia ought to be looking at the future. In a way, it's not just about India, but if we begin to engage with the young people of India, we are engaging with the world at large. I believe that the young people of India, including some of our students, are not only going to be shaping the future of India, but also will be, like you, shaping the future of the world. And hence, to be able to advance the cause of global citizenship, it's important for you to come together and be part of these conversations that the India Immersion program is hosting. In a way, your generation in particular I used to be part of the generation, but I've rapidly aged, and so your generation has this extraordinary opportunity to transcend all the fundamental principles that we believed and previous generation believed in limiting our imagination to nationality as well as other limiting factors. You can transcend almost all these limiting factors and develop a sense of cosmopolitanism which the world has never seen before. And for you to develop that, you need to develop a greater sense of diversity and pluralism and understanding of other societies, and in a way the understanding of Indian society and Indian context becomes important to you. So I want to end by saying that you are part of a pioneering generation of Australians who are having this opportunity to engage with India, to engage with Indian society, Indian culture, Indian students, as well as Indian institutions, and hopefully you take back the best of what we have and also the kind of challenges that we are facing. One of the things about India is that it has the potential to make you feel never to return again, and that is part of our experience. So in a way you need to, as I want to reinstate the thought of the fact that you are still in a very protected environment. You are obviously spoiled here, and that's okay. Our students are also spoiled here, but beyond what the campus has to offer, I will strongly encourage you to discover India and its complexities. And I think it's really it's one of those societies where you can actually see things as it is, and there are not many societies that are there today. I would strongly encourage you to read a book by a very distinguished philosopher by name Michael Sandel. Michael Sandel is a professor of moral philosophy at Harvard University, and his book, which was published a few years ago, is entitled "What Money Can't Buy: The Moral Limits of Markets." And Michael has argued in that book about the fact that how we have increasingly moved to a society in which everything that we do is measured in monetary terms, and as a consequence of that, there are two consequences of that society. One is that corruption and inequality. He talks about US, but essentially that could be comparable to any part of the world. And he basically talks about the contemporary America in which almost all the things that we do are measured in monetary terms, and the disparities of income and wealth is deeply reflected in the society, but more importantly, higher degree of insensitivity is infused into the plight of the marginalized and the downtrodden. In India, all those things are obviously applicable, but you still have an opportunity to see that space available despite people living in extremely impoverished conditions. And I think that makes us feel more responsible about what we as a university, we as students of various disciplines including law can do towards seeking some sort of a transformation and change. I know I've taken more time than I should, but I want to stop here, and I want to thank you for being here. I sincerely hope that you have an inspiring and engaging and empowering and deeply reflective experience of being in India. I'm sure I will have an opportunity to spend more time with you. Without further ado, it is my proud privilege to invite Honorable Mr. Justice Michael Kirby to deliver his speech.
Welcome to India and to this unique experience in your lives. I feel myself to be privileged to be here, and I congratulate this university on having this program that is designed to show commonalities in our human existence, if we are from Australia or linked to Australia, and if we are from India, linked to India. It's a wonderful thing, and to get it at your age is a marvellous opportunity for you, and you've got to make the most of it. My remarks, like Caesar's Gaul, are going to be divided into three parts. First, I'm going to speak about work I've done recently in the international community as chair of the Commission of Inquiry of the United Nations Human Rights Council on North Korea, because unless we can sort out the problems of North Korea, and by the way also the problems of climate change, the long-term future of the human species could be in doubt, and therefore it's a pretty important issue, and it's one in which I've had the privilege recently of being involved. And because Sean Starr billed me to speak on that subject, I'm going to have to speak on it for a little while, but not too long, because as I spoke with the Vice-Chancellor before I came here, we agreed that if I were just to speak about North Korea, and I could speak about it, my partner says I could speak about it under wet concrete for hours and days. So fascinating and so frightening is its potential. It's not really getting into your minds about why we are here, why you are specifically here, why you are particularly and specifically in New Delhi and at this university and in this course. That's something that would be just as relevant if I were at Indiana University or in the university in Myanmar. It's not specific to why we are together today. And so I'm going to tell you something about, secondly, my engagement as a lawyer and a judge with one of the instruments that does give a commonality to the people of India, the Constitution of India, the law of India, the ideal of uncorrupted judges in India, the principle that lawyers and judges have the privilege to contribute to an ordered and safe society where people are not likely to be murdered in the streets. It can happen, but it's not the norm. And that is something which India and Australia rejoice in as countries of the rule of law and of the fundamental principles of law and constitutionalism, which is a contribution lawyers make to a better world, a world that has enough predictability that we feel, we know that we're going to be basically safe going about our lives and that things will be ordered in that fashion. And then thirdly, I want to submit myself over as long a time as we can possibly find to your questions, because you know what you want to talk about, and you wouldn't be here if you weren't very bright, and therefore you should have the chance to try and tax me on the issues that interest you, which are ultimately going to be very interesting to me and also to the Vice-Chancellor. I mean, this is the thrill and the expectation of a meeting such as this. Now, before I get to those three subjects, I'm going to mention how my love of India grew. In 1969, I met my partner, Johan. We've been together since that day. He was still there when I waved goodbye to come to India for this event. And it was he who said, "You're working too hard, we're not getting younger," we were both 29, and we've got to have an adventure before it's too late. And I've just read about the London to Sydney race across Central Asia, and I think that would be a fabulously exciting thing to do. Don't be predictable. Don't be boring. Do something unusual. Come with me in a combi van across Central Asia. And I said, but I'm a lawyer. And he said, yes, I know that, but that means you got a little bit of money clinking along. And I want to go to India. I've always had a dream about India. I'm even willing to drive through India. I'm even willing to take on all the cows of India. I want to see Cape Comorin, Cape Kumari. I want to go down there and see the sunset in Cape Kumari, which is where our Vice-Chancellor came from. It's something that people say, if there are 100 things you must do before you die, you've got to go to Cape Kumari and see the sun setting on the Arabian and the Indian Oceans, and you see the wonder of India and the majesty of the sunlight in India, catching the dust of India. It's the one big advantage of dust. It makes magnificent sunsets. And so I said, but I'll lose so much money. My career will be finished. You're giving me a death sentence. My career, my glorious career as a lawyer, what will happen to me? I'll never be anybody. And all I will have done is gone through India to fulfill your dream. But Johan has beautiful blue eyes. And so I gave in. And we bought a combi van in Australia. You can't drive to India from Australia. There are oceans. And we put the combi on a ship at Sydney, and we shipped it to Singapore. And then we got in the combi van and we drove up the spine of Malaysia, up into Thailand, and the Vietnam War was going on at that time. This is how long ago it is. This is 50 years ago. And the Vietnam War had a lot of soldiers who were fighting a deathly war in Vietnam, just across the Gulf of Thailand. And they were having R&R, and villagers would bring them chicken, and they were honouring the American soldiers, and the media was telling us how wicked the American soldiers were. So it was all very confusing, because when you actually explore the world has all sorts of information and messages that often challenge what you're told in media. Anyway, you can't drive from Malaya to India because of Burma, Myanmar. There were wars on there. There were liberation wars and three freedom movements going on in Burma at the time. And so we had to ship the combi from Penang to Madras, as Chennai was then called. And that's where we got into our Indian adventure. And we went down from Chennai, past Manipuripuram, down to Cape Kumari, and then up to Kovalam on the western coast in Kerala. Every part so marvellous and different. It's such, you're seeing this country of enormous variety in relatively small space, and then up into the hills, the Nilgiri hills, to see Uttarakhand, and then down into Calcutta, and then up the road that leads through Lucknow and Varanasi, and up through Raebareli to Delhi, and this is the exploration of India we made, and we both look back on it now, 50 years later, and say, if we did one really wonderful thing in our lives, that was it. It was also very interesting later when we drove up through Pakistan. And we saw the enormous commonalities between India and Pakistan. There, ladies and gentlemen, is a tragedy that for various reasons, and it's all understandable if you read the history, why it happened, but it's a tragedy. And then into Afghanistan. This was just a short moment of history when it was safe to drive into Afghanistan, up through Jalala, through the Khyber Pass. I've been through the Khyber Pass 3 times. Up through the Khyber Pass, up to Jalalabad, up to Kabul, up to the Salang Tunnel. We actually went in search of the Bamiyan Buddhas. Oh. They've been destroyed since by the barbarous Taliban. But for another story, we didn't actually get there. The roads were too bad. But then through Iran, under the Shah, through Turkey, through Eastern Europe, the communist regimes of Eastern Europe, and then through to England and the Netherlands. And this was a marvellous adventure. So my main message to you today is really the same message as the Vice-Chancellor has given you. You're only going to live once. You have this strange experience of consciousness. If we stop and think about it, it's very peculiar that we know about ourselves and our family, and we think about existence and why we are human beings, and that there is a Milky Way out there, an endless universe. We're sending little probes out to Mars and to Saturn, weaving through the rings around Saturn in our lifetime. It's so exciting, so unusual, so peculiar, and it's out there, and we exist, and we don't know if anybody else exists in this universe. But make the most of your life. Don't be too predictable. You've got to be a bit predictable. You've got to make enough money, and you've got to have a life, and you've got to have families and so on. And that's all very good and very important to your existence. But don't just do the predictable thing. This little opportunity for you here is a sort of microcosm of what I got in that year off. We did it twice. And if I hadn't been appointed a judge, we probably would have just kept doing that. That was our life. You would do that, and then you would go back, work like hell as a barrister, and then go off again for another year. But it did make me stop and think about the purposes of life, the purposes of my life, of how I could contribute to a better world, and how we are all together. I mean, when you drive across Asia, you realise all these man-made borders are nothing. People live and interrelate and merge into each other, and nations merge in, and we are all humans. We all share this. And it's very important for you to know and think about these things. And in your busy lives at home, if you're with DFAT, God, you just don't have time to think about these things. But you are now being separated from ordinariness. And this is a very rare opportunity, and you are very lucky to have it. And you should use it to think, how can I do something equivalent to Kirby's combi trip? Because you may not think about that sort of thing, changing the patterns of days if you're just in the midst of your ordinary daily life. So that's the first message. The second message is, don't just think about your own country. It's so 19th century. It's very important to think about the big world and about the fact that we need ways to cooperate together, because it's very dangerous if we don't. It's dangerous with climate change, because otherwise it's going to... I believe last week, I was in Sydney, I was working in my chambers. Who would be working in their chambers on the 1st and 2nd of January? Only a nut like me. Working in my chambers, And the Daily Telegraph, a very reliable newspaper in Sydney, Australia, had the heading, "This is Sydney, the hottest place on the planet." That was last week in Sydney, Australia. It was 48 degrees of the news scale. Now, I don't know how to convert to Fahrenheit, but I believe that's well above 100. And it's really what, in my childhood, was a sort of once-in-a-lifetime experience. And this is climate change. So that's a very important issue, and nuclear weapons are a very important issue, non-proliferation. And that brings me to North Korea. The United Nations has a body which is answerable to the General Assembly. That body is called the Human Rights Council. It used to be called the Human Rights Commission. The Human Rights Council has been going strong for, I think, 23 years. Australia has just been elected to it for the first time. And the Human Rights Council had so many reports about cruelty and violence and deprivations of human rights, serious deprivations of human rights in North Korea, that they decided to set up a commission of inquiry. I was at a conference in England of statisticians, very clever people, statisticians. If you get a chance, meet statisticians. They've got a lot to teach us, especially lawyers. And I got a phone call, and it was the office of the Honourable Senator, the Honourable Robert Carr, asking whether I would agree to my name going forward to be chair of a new commission of inquiry that the Human Rights Council was establishing on North Korea. I said, well, I'll have to consult my partner about that. I did. He said, why not do it? It sounds different and unusual. And so I did it. And we effectively had 7 months in which to prepare our report. We knew that North Korea would not allow us in. We decided that we would do the report in a way different from most United Nations inquiries. We decided to do it in the manner of the Anglo-American, Australian, Indian legal system. We would do it in public. We would do it transparently. We would have media able to come in and watch us doing it so that we could be judged as we were doing our job. And though we couldn't get into North Korea, that was not a problem at all, because there were 29,000 refugees from North Korea living in South Korea alone, and they were scattered elsewhere in the world. And so we saw them, we sat in public, we got their information. I knew from the time I'd been an appellate judge for so long in Australia what a menace are judges who do not say, we find, I find. And so we had to say what our findings were. We had to describe the testimony we were receiving. We had to relate it to the mandate of 9 points. But we also had to say what we found on the basis of the evidence and what that was measured against the United Nations principles of human rights. And so we found starvation on a terrible scale. We found a system of detention camps on a shocking scale, not only of people who are suspected of offending the government, but also their families as contagion to the society. We found terrible cruelty to women, forced abortions, and we found abductions of people in neighbouring countries, especially Japan. And all of this we recorded, we made our findings, we reported, and the United Nations Human Rights Council gave us strong support. They voted strongly in favour of the report. They sent it to the General Assembly, and they recommended that the General Assembly send it on to the Security Council, which they did. It's only one of 2 cases, the other being Myanmar, Burma, where the General Assembly has sent a human rights report to the Security Council, because the General Assembly accepted our recommendation that unattended North Korea was not only a danger to its own people for human rights, but was a danger to peace and security in the world. And that is where the matter rests at the moment. 4 weeks ago, I was in New York at a meeting of the Security Council, which reverted to our report, and Nikki Haley said, until we deal with the human rights situation in North Korea, we will not have peace in North Korea. You cannot divorce fundamental human rights and human rights abuses from international peace and security. But that's all very interesting, and it is objectively important, and it's made more important by developments even since we did our inquiry, by reason of the missile and nuclear tests that have been conducted by North Korea. So it's objectively important, but it's not specific to why you are here. That's something you can learn in any course, and it's worthy of attention, especially because of the nuclear issues. But what my engagement with that exercise arose out of was my engagement with the world, and that arose out of the combi trip, and that arose out of seeing the connections of us all. But when I was a judge, as I was for 34 years, I revisited India. I came back here many times. You can take the boy or the girl out of India, but you can never take India out of you kids now. You're going to have India. Maybe 4 weeks or so isn't long enough, but you will get some aspect of this mysterious, unusual, exciting, and increasingly important country, and it's hard to get it out of your head. But anyway, I started to show an interest in India and the judiciary of India, and I kept coming back here. And the judiciary of India, which is a very distinguished judiciary, and basically uncorrupted, and a judiciary of great intellectual strength, was actually interested that I was interested in them, because most Australian judges, frankly, weren't. And most Indian judges weren't all that interested in Australia. I mean, we had a very common similarity in our legal system, but we were like ships in the night. We didn't really have much to do with each other. And one of the great judges that I met so many wonderful judges, and the Vice-Chancellor has referred to 2 of them. Justice Krishna Iyer was a very a wonderful, and I'd add Justice Khanna. I also met Justice Khanna, who was a very brave judge in India, very brave during the emergency, and that's another story. But Justice Bhagwati, P.N. Bhagwati, he died last year, and he was the Chief Justice of India. And he was, like me, very engaged with the world, the wider world. And so he chaired a meeting of judges, and they invited 2 non-final judges. That's to say, there's a club of judges who are judges of final courts, and they meet each other, not too often, but they meet each other, and they rather look down on judges from non-final courts. But they invited 2 judges from non-final courts. One was myself. I was at that time the President of the Court of Appeal of New South Wales, which in the Australian legal system was a pretty high judge. It's just next to the High Court, but not of the High Court of Australia. And the other was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was a judge of the Washington-based Federal Appeals Court, based in Washington. And she was just about to be appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States, where she still is. And I was just about to be appointed to the High Court of Australia, where I still am not. And this was a meeting to think about what was a very unusual and to many people, many lawyers, a challenging idea. We can't leave all the problems of the world to the UN. We can't leave it to the work of the Human Rights Council and so on. How can we spread international law through the municipal legal systems, through the national legal systems in countries like Australia and India? And so this group of judges, there were, I think, 11 of us, met in Bangalore in South India, and we formulated the Bangalore Principles on the domestic application of international human rights law. So that was what we were looking at. And the notion was that national courts could themselves contribute to the development of international human rights by applying international human rights in their decision making where it was not incompatible with the national court's constitutional obligations. To an Australian, that was not such a peculiar idea, because those of you who are lawyers, and I know not all of you are lawyers, you will know that there is that peculiar provision in the Australian Constitution that talks about states' courts exercising federal jurisdiction. And the notion behind the Bangalore Principles was the notion of a national court exercising international jurisdiction, and thereby bringing interstitially, and where it was compatible with the local legal system, the international law of human rights and other international law into the national system, so that in the age of the iPhone and of the jumbo jet and global issues, the law would be beginning to adapt to the introduction of international law into the domestic system. Now, some people hated that idea. Justice Scalia, a judge who recently died in the United States, he hated it. America first was his view. And there were judges in Australia, they hated it. And I had such a difficult time trying to convince judges. But in Australia, a big case came up called the Mabo case. Some of you, even non-lawyers, will have heard about it. It was the case where the Australian High Court held that we had to recognise the native title of the Indigenous people, which they'd been seized of their land, and they'd had their land taken away from them by the settlers, and they were not given recognition of their claim to native title. And the basis of the reasoning of the High Court was the Bangalore idea that you could not deny respect for the rights of one group in the population simply because of their race, that was contrary to international human rights law, and that was a principle of international law which was brought into the Australian legal system in the Mabo case. So I began to make useful developments in my life as a judge, but there was a lot of resistance to the idea, and that's another matter that we can talk about. And fundamentally, that's really what I came to say. I wanted to tell you how you must look on this experience as not just an opportunity to sit and hear very clever people talking about things that are of interest to them. You've got to keep asking yourself, how am I going to make the most of this to do something unusual in my life? Because you only get one bite at this particular cherry, And this is a moment when you're dragged away from your ordinary lives and you want to use the opportunity to reflect upon, hey, what you're going to do to make the most of it. Secondly, I wanted to tell you that a lot of important things are happening now to which Indians and Australians can contribute, and Afghanis and people from Russia and others who are here. They can contribute in the United Nations. And it can be a maddening institution, but it's very important for the peace, security and human rights of the world. And thirdly, that even in our own little lives, including as judges, we can play a part in adapting the world to the realities of our interconnections as human beings on this tiny blue planet with all of its beauties, with the music of J.S. Bach and the poetry of Wordsworth and the beauty of the paintings of Rembrandt and all the other wonderful things that come from the diversity that the Vice-Chancellor was speaking of, and giving respect to that diversity, because it's something very special in our species and it is worthy of protection and preservation. Okay, well that's all I came to tell you, and now this is the moment I love. This is now going to be Q&A, and you get a chance. But first of all, can I invite you to join with me in thanking our Vice-Chancellor for giving us the opportunity to be here, thanking him for his enthusiasm, thanking him for being from Cape Kumari, and for inviting us. Basically, his message was, think outside the square. And as highly intelligent and clever people with this unusual experience you've been offered, that's what you've got to do. You've got to think outside the square and ask, well, what am I going to do with my life and how can I make it of interest and use to me and those I love? Okay, big round of applause.